How's it going, guys? This is Jeremy with Commander Quantified, our second episode of Quantified Theory on Ramp. If you like my content, please support me on Patreon, like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click the bell icon to get notifications for when I put out new content. This episode is going to be unofficially sponsored by Tony Hawk Pro Skater, because have you ever tried to do a 360 varial McTwist without a ramp? So the first question we have to ask ourselves if we're going to start to quantify ramp is what exactly that is. So what is ramp? It is any spell or effect that can increase the amount of mana available to you for the remainder of the game. So there are just so many different types of ramp that you can run into. Going through this, I was like, okay, this episode's going to take a long time. There is land ramp, where you put lands into play, mana rocks that tap for mana, fortifiers, creature ramp, passive ramp, conditional ramp, rituals, and treasures. But we're going to be going over all that, so hang tight here. So we'll start out with land ramp, and land ramp is a spell or ability that puts additional lands into play from your hand or library. Some specific examples of this. Let's go for rampant growth. This is probably the namesake for ramp. It is a sorcery for 1 and a green. Search your library for a basic land card, put that card into the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Very simple. Go get a land from your deck, put it into play tapped, move on. The second one we're going to look at is a new one, Archaeomancer's Map for 2 and a white. It is an artifact. When Archaeomancer's Map enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 basic plains cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is a really interesting one. I like Archaeomancer's Map a lot. Normally white is a play from behind color, as far as like you're going to be playing catch up for the entire game if you're playing mono white. This is an example of that, but you are going to be with the player that has the most lands with this card, which is why it's so good. As long as you have lands in hand, you'll be able to continue playing. Next, we're going to look at Mitch's favorite, Wayfarer's Bauble. It is a 1-cost artifact. Says pay 2, tap and sacrifice Wayfarer's Bauble, search your library for a basic land card, put that card on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. It basically does what Rampant Growth does. It does cost 1 more mana, so it would lose points in our efficiency category, but you're still, if you cast your Wayfarer's Bauble on 1 and crack it on 2, it ends up doing the same thing as Rampant Growth. The last one we're going to look at is the Binding of the Old Gods. It is an enchantment saga for 2 black-green, and the first stage of the saga is destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. The second is search your library for a forest card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library, and the third is creatures you control gain death touch until end of turn. So what we're looking at is really the second part of this saga. 4 is kind of the cap where you want your ramp to be, unless you are playing a landfall deck, in which case this works very well. And notice that it says search your library for a forest card, not a basic forest card. So this means that you can get your forest swamp hybrids, the new snow lands, you can get your shock lands, or if you have them, God bless you, the beta revised duels. Yeah, you can go get those with this. Next, let's move on to mana rocks, and mana rocks are an artifact that taps for mana. That's it. That's the whole thing. But let's give some examples of this. The classic for our format is Soul Ring. It's not legal pretty much anywhere else. It is a 1-cost artifact that has tap to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. This powers out commanders early. It is the best in the developing quadrant, we'll talk about that later, for ramp, just because it puts you ahead so far. And it's actually still pretty cheap. It's $2 for a Soul Ring, and the only thing that comes anywhere close is like a Mana Crypt, which is still going to deal 3 damage to you 50-50% of the time. Next, we're going to look at Arcane Signet, the mistake that Wizards made and then had to kind of reprint a ton of times in order to make it work. It is a 2-cost artifact. Add 1 mana of any color to your command. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and that is a tap ability. Works really well. It's 1 mana of any color, fixes you, ramps you, works really well in pretty much any deck. Talisman of Progress. This is a 2-cost artifact. It has tap to add 1 colorless to your mana pool, or tap to add white or blue to your mana pool, and it deals 1 damage to you. Talismans are an entire cycle, as are signets. The signets usually you have to pay 1 into, and then you get 2 different colors out of them. The talismans you can immediately tap for mana on turn 2 if you play them and play an additional spell. That's why talismans are usually regarded as the better of the 2. Arcane Signet obviously being an exception on that side. And then you've got Commander Sphere, which is an oldie but a goodie. It is a 3-cost artifact that has tap, add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity, and you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Like I said, just an oldie but a goodie. Not a lot of people play it anymore. It's good if you can recur artifacts in mass or even individually, just because you can get used to that card draw multiple times. So yeah, that's Mana Rocks. Next, we're going to look at Mana Fortifiers, and these are effects that increase the amount of mana permanents produce. So you can do like your aura enchantments, like Utopia Sprawl, which is a 1-cost green enchantment aura, and you enchant a forest specifically. As Utopia Sprawl enters the battlefield, choose a color. Whenever Enchanted Forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color as well. So this is great. This is early game ramp. It kind of continues to move the plan of like aggressive strategies forward. Usually you prefer mana dorks over this, but in like an enchantress strategy works really well too, because late game it draws you a card. That's just what all the enchantresses do, is whenever you play an enchantment, draw a card. Yeah, play it. It's good. The next one we're going to look at is Crypt Ghast. It is 3 and a black for a creature spirit 2/2. It has Extort, which is whenever you cast a spell, you may pay black or white. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain that much life. Notably, this can be played in a mono black deck, just because the white is in the reminder text. It is not actually part of the card. Whenever you tap a swamp for mana, add black to your mana pool. So it doubles up on your swamps, which is something that a few like 1-cost instants do, but this does consistently. Next we have Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. It is a legendary creature human druid for a green and a blue. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. It is a 2/2. And it has an activated ability, 5 green blue. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this does have a mana sink, which is really cool. This is a very powerful card. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced, which means if you tap your Arcane Signet for blue, it adds blue-blue. If you tap it for green, it adds green-green. You get the point. Anything that's not a land, that's what you play in this deck. Next, we're going to look at Goldspan Dragon, which is a flying haste 4/4 for 3 red. And whenever Goldspan Dragon becomes the target of a spell or ability, you create a treasure token. And treasures you control have tap, and you can add and sacrifice them. You can add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. Great card. Played in lots of different formats. Yeah, so these are Fortifiers. Next, we're going to look at Creature Ramp, which is going to be creatures that add mana to your pool, usually by tapping. The first one we're going to look at is Rada, Heir to Keld. It is a red and a green for a legendary creature elf warrior for a 2/2. Whenever Rada, Heir to Keld attacks, you may add 2 red mana, and you can tap to add green. You totally thought I was going to say Llanowar Elves first, didn't you? Well, it's second, so there you go. Llanowar Elves is a 1-cost green elf druid for a 1/1. It has tap, add green to your mana pool. These fit really well on the curves of odd-costed green commanders. So these are where you usually add these little mana dorks. And then you have Curious Homunculus. Sorry about that. 1 and a blue for a 1/1. Tap to add colorless to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. So this is a little bit limiting in what it can cast, but it still does count as long as it casts at least 25 cards in your deck. We talked about that in the last episode. For anything that has kind of a restrictive usage, you do want to have at least 25 cards that it can qualify to interact with. Last, we're going to look at Iron Mirror. It is a 2-cost 1/1 artifact creature, Myr. Tap to add red to your mana pool. So this is one of the few things that taps to add red. Great card again. You're going to be playing this in like your Alabu Ancient Witness deck. I think I actually bring that up later. Yeah, so here's Creature Ramp. Next, we're going to look at Passive Ramp, and that is cards that produce mana without additional steps. So no tapping, no interacting with them in any way. They just do their thing. The first one we're going to look at is Carpet of Flowers. It is a 1-cost green enchantment. During your main phase, you may add up to X mana of one color to your mana pool, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. Very good in your blue heavy pods, highly played in competitive EDH. Next, we're going to look at Belby Corrupted Observer. It is a black-green legendary creature, zombie elf, 2/2. At the beginning of each player's post-combat main phase, that player adds colorless for each of your opponents who lost life this turn. Very powerful. Can end up being like 8 mana easily. And you can just kind of cast a free Wormcoil Engine off of it. I didn't say that if anybody asks. Next, we're going to look at Black Market, which is a 3/black enchantment. Whenever a creature dies, put a charge counter on Black Market. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add a black for each charge counter on Black Market. So this definitely accumulates and continues to accumulate mana production for you. The last one we're going to look at is Clothis, God of Destiny. It is a 1 red-green legendary enchantment creature god, indestructible. As long as your devotion to red and green is less than 7, Clothis is not a creature. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a land card, you may add either red or green to your mana pool. You gain 2 life, and Clothis deals 2 damage to each opponent. Next, we're going to add Conditional Ramp, and that's going to be an effect that adds a variable amount of mana based on meeting certain criteria. The very famous one is Gaia's Cradle. It is a legendary land that adds green to your mana pool for each creature you control as a tap. Cabal Coffers, also a land. You pay 2 and tap it to add a black for each swamp you control. Circle of Dreams Druid kind of qualifies as a mana dork because no matter what, it will tap for just 1 green. It is green, a creature elf 2/1, and you can tap it to add green for each creature you control. So it does include itself, thus it's also a mana dork, but it is kind of conditional how much you get out of it. Fabro Elder is a 1 green-white creature treefolk druid. It has vigilance, and Fabro Elder gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control, and you can tap it for each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color. So this is great in your 5-color decks if you're playing something like Gigantha or Kenrith or Sisay or you name it, Joda. You get to basically cast just about anything off of this creature. It's very good. And next we're going to talk about Rituals, and Rituals are an effect that temporarily gives access to an abnormally large amount of mana. First we're going to talk about Dark Ritual, which is really where this gets its namesake. It is a single black mana for an instant that just says add 3 black to your mana pool. The next one we're going to talk about is a power card, Jeska's Will. It is 2 and a red for a sorcery. Choose 1. If you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both. That's usually what you want to do. You add red for each card in target opponent's hand, and you can exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So this is both ramp and card draw on a single card. Usually this basically puts you ahead if you are at parity or behind. Very good card. And the last one we're going to look at is High Tide, which is a blue mana for an instant. Until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, that player adds blue to his or her mana pool. So this also works for your opponents. Keep that in mind. But it is technically, it does qualify as a ritual. The one thing that we do have to note is that it does not actually count as ramp. None of these do. The reason being is our definition for ramp was something that provides mana for the remainder of the game as long as it's not interrupted or destroyed. So these do not qualify. They only do it for one turn. They are still very powerful, and there are instances where you should use them if you are playing in higher powered play groups that require you to get powerful, more explosive turns early. These are still a viable option, but for a classical kind of like non-competitive environment, I would just say that these are kind of a no-go. Next, let's talk about treasure producers. Treasure producers are just permanents that create treasure tokens. Smothering Tithe is a 3 and a white enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. I'm just going to abbreviate that from here out as treasure token. So Smothering Tithe is one of kind of the power cards in white. Your opponents are they are going to draw a card on each of their turns, whether they like it or not. So this will always trigger at least once, usually around the table. It's not quite lucrative to spend 2 mana to keep a player off of 1 mana. So that won't happen very often. Next up, we have the new card, Bootlegger's Stash. This is from Streets of New Capenna. It is 5 and a green for an artifact. Lands you control have tapped to create a treasure token. This card I'm kind of mixed on. I'm actually going to put out an episode specifically on treasures in the near future, and I'll kind of talk more about it then. But yeah, keep your eye on this card. It's interesting. Next one we're going to talk about is Pitiless Plunderer. It is a 3 and a black creature human pirate. It is a 1/4 released in Rivals of Ixalan, so this is one of the older treasure creators. Whenever another creature you control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So that obviously has the full explanation. Pitiless Plunderer, really good in any aristocrats type deck. That is the primary purpose of it. You can really get a burst of a ton of treasure tokens. It can combo. I use it in my Luris deck as a substitute for Phyrexian Altar, because if you combine this in any sack outlet, even just a Viscera Seer, it becomes a Phyrexian Altar when you combine the 2 cards. The last one I'm going to talk about is Professional Facebreaker. It is 2 and a red with Menace. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token, and it has sacrifice a treasure token and exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your turn, you may play that card. This is both card draw and ramp. This is absolutely my favorite card from the new set. Shameless plug here. Buy them while you can. So let's take this opportunity to use our 4 core measurements to look at our ramp cards. They are utility, efficiency, synergy, and opportunity. Utility, if you remember, is how many things a card does. Efficiency is how much it costs to do it. Synergy is does it work with at least 25 other cards in your deck. And opportunity is at what points during the game can you use it. We're going to start with Rampant Growth, which is one of the earlier cards we talked about. As far as utility, it is just ramp. It does not do anything else. The efficiency of it is 2 mana to get 1 land. That's actually quite good. Our synergy is going to be dependent on what kind of deck we're playing it in. You don't have to have synergy to play the card. Playing ramp is just going to be good in most scenarios. Opportunity is it's at sorcery speed, so you can only play it during your turn, so it scores 1 out of 4 points there. One of the So I'm going to go ahead and give you a synergy example here. So Omnath, Locust of Creation, he is a legendary creature elemental for non-black, so red, green, white, blue. Whenever Omnath, Locust of Creation enters the battlefield, draw a card. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life. If this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn, if it's the second, add non-black. If it's the third time, it deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. So this card cares about additional lands entering. The best way to do that is usually going to be to play fetches, blech, expensive, nobody likes that, or to use ramp cards, which are much cheaper. You just go get basics, put them into play. You will trigger your landfall commander multiple times if you do that. So Omnath, Locust of Creation was what we just used as an example on the last slide as something that you could have synergy with. But what about if you're playing Smothering Tithe? Or should you play Smothering Tithe in an Omnath, Locust of Creation deck? Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I would say that if you're playing Smothering Tithe, you would be much better off playing something like Brea, Ethereum Shaper, which is a non-green, so it is white, blue, black, red, legendary artifact creature human. When Brea Ethereum Shaper enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, and it has pay 2, colorless, sacrifice 2 artifacts, and choose 1. Brea deals 3 damage to target player or planeswalker. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, or you gain 5 life. Since Smothering Tithe is creating artifact tokens, also artifact tokens that can help pay her 2 mana cost. This is a no-brainer. You would much rather play Smothering Tithe in Brea than in Omnath. Now let's take Rampant Growth, one of the other cards we were looking at earlier. There is a deck that this would not be great in, and that would be Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. I would actually say don't run Rampant Growth in this particular deck. And why would I say that? Well, what does Kinnan do? Kinnan says whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. Well, Rampant Growth doesn't qualify as a non-land, and it doesn't go get a non-land that taps for mana. So instead, let's play Llanowar Elves. So Llanowar Elves in a Kinnan deck taps for green-green rather than just green. So we just choose our ramp according to our deck strategy. That's kind of what we're getting at here. Next, let's talk about ramping on curve. Generally, you want your ramp to curve into your commander. I think I kind of mentioned that earlier, but I'm going to go back over it here. Most of your ramp should curve into your commander. I'm going to be very adamant about that particular one. So Exploration is a 1-cost enchantment. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Synergizes really well and curves right into Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, which is a 1-green-blue legendary creature, Elder Giant 6/6. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Uro enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Its escape cost is exile 5 other cards from your graveyard and play green-green, blue-blue. So Exploration would work really well in an Uro deck because Uro already wants to put extra lands into play. So you are probably running some sort of landfall synergy, and Exploration is just a objectively correct decision if you are trying to get him into play 1 turn early, which is what we're going for here. Next we're going to say Talisman of Dominance, which is a 2-cost artifact. Tap to add colorless, or you can tap to add blue or black and have it deal 1 damage to you. Will help the Rock Cleaver. I believe this is actually in his commander deck, which bodes well for how Wizards is constructing these things at this point. Buy a precon. Works really well. If you're new to the game, it's a good investment. Will Helt is a 2 blue-black legendary creature, zombie warrior. Whenever another zombie you control dies, if it didn't have Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. It can't block, and when it attacks, sacrifice it at the end of combat. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a zombie. If you do, draw a card. It is a 3/3. So notice that the 2 it curves right into the 4. So you play Talisman of Dominance on turn 2. On turn 3, you untap, play an additional land. You have 4 mana available. You play Wilhelt. Curves right into your commander, goes seamlessly. That's what we're looking for our ramp to do. Next, we're going to say it's Iron Myrrh, which is a 2-cost artifact creature. We talked about this one earlier. It's just a 1/1 that taps for red. This is something that I would put, this is a little bit different, right? Because Alabu, Ancient Witness, is a 3 red-white. It is a 5-cost commander. Now in red-white, you're not really looking at a lot of 1-cost ramp. Just not a lot of it exists in those colors. So in order to curve into this, to at least play it 1 turn early, we are probably going to be playing 2-cost ramp and playing it on turn 4. So consider that when you're building the deck. Play plenty of 4-drops so that you can make the best use of that turn that you're taking off from casting your commander. But yeah, ramp on curve as much as you can. It's not always possible. All right, let's go to takeaways. The takeaways we need to take from this particular episode is going to be the purpose of ramp is to move you ahead 1 or more turns, which means that if you play your ramp on turn 2, like most of us are going to, that you are going to have 4 mana available to you as soon as you play a land on turn 3. Usually by the end of the game, people have ramped at least 2 times. That is the general consensus. And in order to stay ahead and not fall behind or into parity with your opponents, you are going to want to have ramp that synergizes well with your deck, which is the next point actually. Ramp just comes in many different varieties. You saw all the different ones that we went through. Choose the ramp that best synergizes with your overall strategy. If you're playing Prosper, play ramp that can potentially exile something, or treasure tokens, or Goldspan Dragon as an enhancer is a great one. And lastly, let's curve your ramp into your commander. If you're playing a 4-cost, you play your 2-drops. If you are playing green, you play your 1-drops. As much as you can, curve your ramp into your commander. Alright, that is going to be the end of this particular episode. Again, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please do so. That will help me to continue creating content. And like and subscribe to this channel. We're going to end this off with a quote from a Magic card. This one is from District Guide. It is, "The route is direct but challenging. Incidentally, how are you with heights?" With that, we'll talk to you later.